Hi, thank you for coming. Thanks to the Chicago Humanities Festival for having me talk this afternoon. I'm excited to talk to you about what has changed over time with European and American tattoo history. We tend to think of the tattoo explosion. It seems like there's been a tattoo explosion in recent decades, that tattoos are everywhere, that this is something new and exciting. There are some things that are new, and it is very exciting, but tattooing has a much longer history in the West than a lot of people understand. So I'm going to show you sort of where we started with European and American tattooing and where we've come today. So how did we get from this, which are 5,500-year-old tattoos on Otzi the Iceman, to this, which is a tattoo by Esther Garcia, who kindly introduced me this afternoon. A really elegant, very detailed, beautiful, large-scale piece. How do we get from this? This is an image of Thracian women on a Greek pottery fragment from 380 BC. To this. This is a tattoo by Amanda Wakub from New York, and this doesn't even really look like a tattoo, right? Hard to believe this is a tattoo, but it's a tattoo. How do we get from this? Pilgrimage tattoos from 1699 on German diplomat Heinrich Wilhelm Ludolf. To this. And this is a tattoo by Michael de Poissy from France, and he only does stained glass tattoos. Only stained glass tattoos. And I specifically picked this picture when I saw an image of the room that I would be talking in, because I thought that it would mimic where the missing stained glass window is, and I thought that looks pretty good. Most people, even today, even with this incredible popularity of tattooing, still think of our Western, our European and American tattoo history as tinged with the taboo or the deviant. When people tend to think of our tattoo history, we think of images like this biker with all of his tattoos, or images like these prisoners. This notion that tattooing was something for only marginal populations or deviant personalities is something that has been a myth that's been perpetuated in the media, particularly in recent years, where we read over and over again articles with a lead along the lines of this contemporary tattoo explosion positioned against this titillating dark history of tattoos. It's a good story, right? But it's not necessarily true as much in the media. Happens to be. Tattooing in the West did go through what I call the Dark Age, a brief period in this long 5,500 plus year history of Western tattooing that lasted from about 1900 to 1960. And of course, because we only tend to look at the history of our grandparents' generation when we think about something historical, we tend to only think, oh, if that's what my grandparents thought, that's what everybody before my grandparents thought. So we tend to think of this sort of dark age of American tattooing in the first half of the 20th century as sort of the way tattoo history has always been. Where did this myth come from? It starts in the late 19th century with a group of European criminologists One of whom was Cesare Lombroso, who wrote an article that appeared in Popular Science Monthly from 1896 called The Savage Origin of Tattooing. And this was one of a number of pieces that were written by these criminologists that talk about how tattoos should only be for they're a mark of atavism and savage spirit, and they shouldn't be inscribed upon elite people. There was an elite tattoo fad at the time. I'll show you some pictures of a little bit later. And because these articles were published in prominent magazines like Popular Science Monthly, it did actually set off a cultural aversion, especially among middle and upper middle class on up culture toward tattooing that lasted until about the 1960s. The picture is not quite as simple as that, and I'll show you something in a little bit that will complicate this. But it definitely was influential. This Lombroso article, you can't see it because the captions are in the way, but there's a right there. Derver Brecker, 1893. I'm going to show you an image from that text that he refers to. Oops. Excuse me. One more. There we go. This is an image from Abraham Bayer's The Criminal, basically, from 1893. It's a visual catalog of all the tattoos that he was seeing on these incarcerated populations that he was studying. And one of the things that these criminologists did is they only studied incarcerated populations. So if you're only studying tattoos on criminals, of course, what are your conclusions going to be? That they're a mark of criminals. They weren't studying them on other people. And Bayer's text, interestingly enough, took images of the tattoos here, and he put the number of convictions right next to it, 13 convictions, and then listed out exactly what all the crimes were. So some of the crimes listed here are resisting arrest, that's Widerstand, mischief, Unfug, disorderly conduct here. If you want to condition your readers toward a particular interpretation of the material that you're presenting, I can't think of a more compelling way to do it than to actually list out their crimes right next to their tattoos. So this literature did have an influence on people. Tattooing does decline to a certain extent in Western society right around the turn of the 20th century. But this next image is one of the images that I think helps complicate this picture. These are ads from the Marlboro cigarette campaign. These are both from 1958. This campaign went on for over a decade. And although the tattoos in the ads, the tattoos on the back of the hands are temporary tattoos, they're fake tattoos. They're not actually, they never photographed anybody with a real tattoo. The tattoos are used to symbolize strength, machismo, service, toughness. These are not negative qualities. And so when I think about this campaign, it makes me when I first started to think about this campaign, it made me realize that the way we look at history can get very colored. Was there perhaps also a tinge of rebelliousness or kind of bad boyness in these ads? I don't know. We could certainly impose that from where we are today, but I don't know if that was actually intended in the moment. So if tattoo history has not been a story of taboo nature and deviant behavior through its entire Western 5,500-year history, what has it been? So I'm going to take you through a few moments in time. We're going to go back to Ötzi the Iceman. Some of you may know his story. He was discovered during an ice melt in the Italian Alps. There's a museum dedicated to him in Bolzano, Italy. It's really amazing. I highly recommend a visit if you're ever in that area of the world. They've done extensive imaging of his body, and they've been able to determine that many of his tattoos, which you see here on his back in a recreation of him, and then here are the actual tattoos on his body. Many of them were probably therapeutic. They correlate with areas of the body where there had been disease or injury. Some of them are unclear. They may have been symbolic. They may have been decorative. It's unclear what they were for. So he had a variety of tattoos. Otzi and some tattoos that have been found in Egypt that date to around the same time are the oldest human artifactual remains we have for tattoos. But that's not to say that that's some sort of originary moment in Western tattooing. It's entirely plausible that people were tattooing for hundreds, thousands of years before this. To start to think about that tattoo history, we need to go to archaeological tools. And this is an image from a French scholarly article from the 60s that posits that these particular tools that you see here were used for tattooing. They were found in a cave that didn't have paintings. They're sharp, right? You can't, oops, didn't mean to hit that. You don't actually draw with a sharp point, right? You don't paint with a sharp point. This is some sort of pigment holder. There's pigment residue in it. So they theorize that these may likely have been tattoo tools. And there's some interesting research happening today by archaeologists where they're recreating different types of archaeological tools. They're tattooing with them. They're analyzing the wear patterns on the end, and then they're comparing them back to the actual historical examples. And so they've been finding some tools that they're really able to make convincing cases were actually used for tattooing. Not quite this old yet, the operative word. So it's exciting to think that this history may be far, far longer than the human remains evidence that we have. I'll go back to the Thracian women. So Thrace, of course, is in southwestern Europe, in the area of sort of Bulgaria and the European part of Turkey. The ancient Greeks wrote extensively about tattoos on people surrounding their society, particularly the Thracians, and they were often depicted in pottery and other forms of art with their tattoos. The Greeks painted the Thracians as wild people, but from evidence, the tattoos appear to be marks of high status, and the depictions start as early as the 5th century BC. It's amazing to think about women in Europe with this many tattoos, just as, you know, I'm walking around today, right? The one thing that, if I've learned anything about studying tattoo history for so many years, is that its popularity and its has ebbed and flowed throughout human history. Christian tattooing has a particularly long and rich history in the West that becomes well documented and publicized in the early modern period, with an explosion of travelers' journals to the Holy Land and various European pilgrimage sites, where they had souvenir tattooing. So these tattoos that you see here are essentially souvenirs, souvenirs of travel to holy sites. Christian tattooing starts as early as the 6th century. We have detailed descriptions from the 6th century of tattoos that are quite similar to what we see here on Ludolf, Christ crucified, and the date. I'll show you some other ones here in a second. The Christian history had kind of disappeared from common knowledge until quite recently. When I first saw this particular image that's on the screen right now in the 1990s, I could not believe that someone this one is from 1669, that someone in 1669 would have had this many tattoos. I actually thought that it was a clever flash sheet of sorts, where individual tattoos, like I thought, oh, okay, so maybe people would have gotten one tattoo. And so I thought it was a compilation on 2 forearms of a variety of people's tattoos. But then I read the text, And it turned out that these were all the tattoos that one man, Raki Stubbe, got on pilgrimage in the Holy Land in 1669. And you can see the arms of Jerusalem here, the 5 crosses. Bethlehem and Jerusalem traveled to multiple cities. Christ crucified, Christ ascendant, the date, multiple dates. Stubbe had as many tattoos as any typical city dweller today, right, in 1669. And this pilgrimage tattoo tradition continues through to today. This is a tattoo that I got a couple years ago in Jerusalem. It's the same Jerusalem cross, copied from a 1612 traveler's journal that I've worked with extensively in my research. Many other people actually have gotten this same image tattooed consistently since at least 1612, if not far before that. The family that tattoos in this particular shop, the Razouks, claim to have been tattooing continuously in their own family for 900 years. And we know that the tradition dates back at least to the 6th century. And of course, I can't talk about religious tattooing, Christian tattooing, without bringing in the incredible Chicano, Latino tradition of black and gray tattoos, which often draw from religious imagery. This is an amazing image by Jose Lopez, who's in Orange County in California, of Christ crucified. And so if you compare this image of Christ crucified to the one that was on Stubbe or Ludolf, you can see that it changes from just sort of a simple outline, pricked outline, because of course tattoos at that time were pricked dot by dot, to this incredibly rendered chiaroscuro, realistic depiction. So clearly tattooing hasn't had only a dark history. It's transformed quite a bit over the years. One thing that has definitely changed is that people are getting bigger tattoos. And it does seem like a larger population, a percentage of the population is getting tattooed today. It is difficult to determine that, however, because we don't have proper evidence of who got tattooed or at what percentage, even before maybe the past 10 years ago. That kind of record keeping just was not kept in a consistent manner. So likely more people are getting tattooed, but unclear really how many more people. I'm going to talk about what I consider to be 5 societal and cultural factors in the 20th century that significantly contributed to where tattooing is today. The first factor is the electric tattoo machine. Samuel O'Reilly is credited with developing the first commercial electric tattoo machine. This is his patent drawing from 1891. There's some debate as to whether he was the first. What's incontrovertible is the impact of electric tattoo machines. Prior to the development of the electric tattoo machine, tattooing was painstakingly rendered, prick by prick, in a slow process that limited both the size of the tattoos and the level of detail. Certainly there were some masters of the tattoo art prior to the invention of the machine with particularly patient clients and they did create some enormous tattoos, but before mechanization, tattoos were generally much smaller and fewer people could be tattooed in the same amount of time. So that in and of itself may have limited how many people got tattooed, not to mention the size of the tattoos. Also, this image is from my friend Lyle Tuttle's collection of a hand tattooing kit from pre-20th century, and I promised him that I would let you all know that he's fundraising for his research center right now. So. The second factor is fine art influence. So prior to the 1970s, European and American tattooing generally fell into a folk art aesthetic, what you see on the right side of the screen here. Typical Sailor Jerry image, bold lines, fist-sized designs, able to be quickly rendered, simple shading, wash of color, not particularly detailed. But Jerry, as with some of these more elite tattooers, also did some incredibly elaborate tattoos. And so the image on your left is also a Sailor Jerry piece, and not the kind that we tend to think about when we think about Sailor Jerry tattoos. He was particularly influenced by Japanese tattooing as a more fine art type of tattooing. And in the 1960s and 1970s, we start to get artists with art school training, with formal fine art training, becoming drawn to tattooing as a medium, as their medium, instead of painting or drawing or printmaking. And one of them is Ed Hardy, of course, who's become a household name at this point in time. This is one of my favorite pieces of his. This is from 1978. It's an Ed Hardy piece from 1978. And Hardy worked extensensively with Sailor Jerry. Jerry was a mentor to him. Hardy learned about Japanese tattooing that way initially, and that connection really allowed Ed Hardy to fuse his formal art training with sort of Japanese aesthetic and create this sort of hybrid design. So you can see here, these flowers are much more delicately rendered than you would see in sort of a Sailor Jerry era tattooing, and mixed with sort of a painterly treatment of the Japanese wind and rocks in the background. By the 1980s, fine artists were wildly experimenting and really taking tattooing to places that it had not ever been before. So we have some radical changes in what tattoo imagery can be by the 1980s. This is an image that has stuck in my mind ever since I first saw it in the early 1990s. It's an image by Cynthia Witkin from 1985. It was published in one of Ed Hardy's many tattoo books that came out in the late 80s and early 90s, and that celebrated these new genres and styles of tattooing that had never been done before. What's remarkable about this from a historical standpoint, it's interesting, at this point in 2018, it doesn't seem that novel. But in 1985, this was like radical tattoo. It doesn't have any black lines. It's not representational. It's abstract. It's conceptual. There had never been conceptual tattooing until this point in the history of Western tattoo, any global tattooing. So by the mid-1980s, tattooing could be almost anything. But how did people know about these new forms of tattooing? And so that leads to my third major factor in how tattoos have transformed into what they are today. And that is photography. Photography, and particularly its dissemination through magazines. So starting in the 1960s, photographs became far easier for the everyday person, like an everyday tattooer, to take. And mass-market photographic printing services became widespread. So no longer did you need a dark room in your basement and a whole bunch of time to be able to carefully develop photographs. You could take pictures, send them to Kodak, Kodak would print them, and send them back to your home. So photography becomes much more accessible to the everyday person. Photographic printing technology, especially for books and magazines, and especially color printing technology, really becomes much more affordable and available by particularly the 1980s, but also the 1970s. So by the late 1980s, we have the rise of tattoo-specific magazines, the first mass-market tattoo-specific magazines. Before that, we had some sort of niche, like industry publications in black and white, but by the late 80s we have mass market tattoo specific magazines. First they were an offshoot of biker magazines, Outlaw Biker Tattoo Review here from 1992, number 7. Then we had some other magazines like International Tattoo Art. The first issue I believe was also in 1992, which is that issue. That took a sort of more elegant, less tawdry approach to tattooing. What's interesting about a lot of these other tattoo magazines is their parent company in most cases is a pornography company. So there was a brief moment in sort of the early to mid 1990s where we had sort of respectful mass market tattoo publications, and pretty quickly it all went tawdry. So unfortunately, tattoo magazines are not particularly well representative of all the tattooing that's happening today. You have to go to the internet for that. These magazines floored me as a punk rock teenager in the 80s and then an art school student in the early 1990s. Oops, one too many. This is another image that's stuck in my head from the very first time that I saw it in the early 1990s. This is a photorealistic Jimi Hendrix by the famous Switzerland tattooer Philip Lou. It was published in a couple of different places. It was in tattoo magazines. It was in one of Ed Hardy's books around that time. And this kind of photorealism was another type of tattoo imagery that just hadn't been done before. It was novel. It was exciting. It was something that was new. I'll segue from Jimmy to Janice to talk about the fourth social and cultural element in sort of this tattoo transition. Oh, wait, Janice. You want Janice? Clicker's a little cranky. There we go. Celebrities and media are the fourth factor. Janis Joplin might be the first celebrity to inspire hordes of women to get tattooed. She got tattooed in the 60s. She had a bold tattoo on a very visible place on her wrist, here. Visible when she performed, visible in most photographs of her, unless she's wearing super long sleeves. She also had a smaller tattoo on her chest. She talked about her tattoos in the media. Women went and got copies of her tattoos. Her tattoos were done by San Francisco artist Lyle Tuttle. And Tuttle himself, perhaps more than any other tattooer ever, has managed to captivate the media, especially in the 60s and 70s, and leverage it to both advocate for tattooing as an incredible form of expression and also to promote his own business. He's a consummate businessman. This is Lyle in a Life magazine roundup from 1972, a yearly roundup. There was a longer article earlier in the year, and I just love how he's just kind of plopped in here between like some very mundane other types of articles, news articles. He was on national TV, he was on the cover of Rolling Stone magazine, he was quoted in Time magazine, and a whole host of other media appearances. And what this did is it helped to destigmatize tattooing, to bring it out of that dark age from about 1900 to 1960, and to bring tattooing back to being hip and cool and desirable. Still a little bit edgy, but something that wasn't necessarily taboo. And of course, since this time period, cable television, the internet, social media have really marched this media frenzy ever farther forward. Interestingly enough, this article about Lyle mentions that he got tattooed in Samoa. And that is going to lead to my last of the 5 factors that really radically transformed tattooing and made it what it is, what we see today in the 21st century, which is non-Western influence. There are 2 different types of non-Western influence I'm going to talk about here. There is black work from Pacific Islander and Native American cultures first, and then Japanese tattooing. These are the covers of 2 books from the 1980s, one sort of mid, and then the other 1989, 1990. This bold blackwork tattooing, called tribal tattooing at the time, started in the early 80s and had become well popularized by the end of that decade. Featured these large geometric black designs drawn from Native American and Pacific Islander influence. So some of the influence was images like this. This is a painting from 1710 of a Mohawk chief from the Iroquois Confederacy. And you can see these kinds of geometric patterns. And then even more of the influence was from Pacific Islander designs. And this is an image from 1813 from Langsdorff of a Marquesan Islander. The rise of tribal blackwork tattoos in the 80s was not without historical precedent, though. And this is an image of Jean-Baptiste Cabri, who jumped ship in the Marquesas Islands in the 1790s and had himself extensively tattooed from head to toe. He then returned to Europe to work at fairs as a tattooed attraction in the early 1800s. A history that has been lost and then refound. Other sailors also got Pacific tattoos. This is an illustration from the frontispiece of sailor William Torrey's 1848 travel account. It clearly shows his Marquesan pattern tattoo hands. And he tells a story of shipwreck and forcible tattooing that interweaves fact and fiction. It was unlikely that he was forced to be tattooed. It's impressive to me to think about men, and unfortunately they were all men at that time, who traveled and got these tattoos, walking around with incredibly large, incredibly visible blackwork pieces, quite similar to the things that we see today in the 21st century on, your barista at Starbucks, right? This is a piece from the 1980s by Leo Zulueta, who is one of the founding fathers of the American and by extension European blackwork movement. And you can see here that it's not literal, it's abstracted. It sort of takes these geometric patterns as influence and then transforms them into something that is originally his. What has happened in recent years is we have artists who are painstakingly recreating some of those Langsdorff designs onto the bodies of Europeans. This is Dmitry Babakin from Russia. He crafts these incredible replicas. This, of course, brings up issues of cultural appropriation and tattooing. When is it okay to not just borrow influence from other cultures, but to actually recreate it on someone who's not from that culture? And that is a topic for its own lecture in and of itself, so I will leave it there. But it's interesting to think about influence versus replication with using another culture as influence in any art form, not just tattooing. I would be remiss if I didn't at least briefly mention that in North America, we do have a revitalization of Native American tattoo practice. It had gone completely extinct. Native American tattoo practice in North America had gone completely extinct. Quite by the mid 1700s. There may be some relics in the late 1700s. But there is a number of artists, indigenous Native American artists, who are revitalizing these types of tattooing. And this is an image from Dion Casas, who's in Canada. And then another offshoot of the black work movement is the move to create European tattoo heritage in places where it didn't exist. So the Celtic tattoo movement, one of the main practitioners of this is Pat Fish, who started also in the 1980s. There is not any evidence that Celtic tattooing ever existed at this point. And if it did, we certainly don't know what it looked like. So she takes other forms of art, manuscripts, metalwork, and she uses those patterns to create these really intricate and elaborate Celtic tattoos. And I think this is and there's a similar rune tattooing that's happening in Europe and things like this. They're creating tattoo traditions, heritage tattoo traditions, where tattoo traditions didn't exist, by using other art forms. And I think this is a really wonderful way of sort of talking about memorializing your cultural heritage and your body with tattoos. Oh. And then, oh, there we go. There we go. And then, of course, this is where black work has, why does it keep going back? There we go. Can you? There we go, perfect. And sort of the pinnacle of black work tattooing is this kind of work that's going on today. This is an image by Rox in San Francisco. It's very abstract. It works with the form of the body. It uses negative space in a really creative way to sort of make bodies sculptural through this black work tattooing. Japanese tattooing, as another influence, starts in the mid-1800s when Japan gets open to the West, and this is what Japanese tattooing looked like in about 1850. Incredibly elaborate. And one of the things about Japanese tattooing that was revolutionary in the minds of Westerners who were seeing it for the first time is that it had lots of color, even more color than is in this image. And again, there's historical precedent for Westerners getting this kind of tattooing before the 21st century. In fact, tourists in Japan were able to get business cards in their guidebooks. So this is a little business card that you could rip out from the guidebook and use it to help you find your tattooer when you were traveling there. This is a guidebook from 1894. What did these tattoos look like? These are images of Charlie Longfellow, who was the son of the famous poet Henry Wadsworth. These are from circa 1871 to 1893. He lived in Japan for a number of years and was extensively tattooed. And interestingly enough, he had previous exposure to tattooing because here on his shoulder is a Civil War era tattoo. And these Japanese tattoos were widely publicized. This is from an article in Scientific American from 1898 of a wealthy American with elaborate Japanese tattoos. I showed you earlier with the Sailor Jerry image and the Ed Hardy image that tattooers have consistently been interested in Japanese tattooing as influence from the mid-19th century. And this is an image from Claudius de Sab, who's a British artist, who also does kind of a fusion of Japanese and Western tattooing, in this case sort of a bold Americana style mixed with some of the Japanese aesthetic to create these really beautiful designs. And for my grand finale, I'm going to just go through a few images of these new genres of tattooing that people in Otzi the Iceman's time could never even have imagined could exist. This is an image by a team of tattoo artists, and we now have artists working together as teams called Trash Polka. This is Simone Pfaff and Volker Merschke, and this really brings graphic design to life. It combines word and image and patterning and symbols into this really rich visual composition. This is an image from Mia Bailey from Atlanta, and I'm bringing him into the discussion to talk a little bit briefly, that's another lecture in and of itself, about the explosion of tattooing in Black urban culture, particularly hip-hop culture. Again, this is a great example of tattooing being driven by celebrities and media and really bringing tattooing to a wider audience that hadn't actually necessarily thought about tattooing as a form of expression before. And we have incredible wealth of tattooing on an African American population now. This is lettering from B.J. Betts. We think about name tattoos, being maybe an inch high and a couple inches wide. This has taken lettering. Lettering in and of itself is now a genre of tattooing, large scale across the body. It's truly like calligraphic art turned into tattooing. This is an image from Dino from Spain. He mixes surrealism with this sort of traditional folk aesthetic. This is a great example to me. I mean, of anything can be tattooed nowadays. Any image that anyone can imagine can get turned into a tattoo on somebody's body. Anybody's signature artistic style, or any client's particular unique vision. This one is by an artist called Caro Lay. She's an itinerant artist who travels around Europe. Her project is really interesting because it's conceptual. It's not about representation. Her project is about making marks on the body. And so what the marks look like is not as important as the actual mark making. And she often collaborates with her clients to hand them the tattoo machine, like self-tattoo, or goes back and forth. And so these are not, again, like that Cynthia Wicken image I showed from 1985, not representational. It's not about the image. My second to last image for today, another image from Esther Garcia, who did the introductions. And this is a great example of where photorealism has been merged with sort of a very painterly style to create these elaborate, elegant, really beautiful, in the traditional sense of beauty, images, large-scale images. And my last image for today. I'll leave you with the brilliant and somewhat controversial tattooer Mark Riedman from Germany. He tattoos across bodies with a team of people. And I will say that I would love to take some of your questions.
Thank you. We're going to circulate some mics. Please raise your hand if you'd like one of us to come to you. Let me get some light up out there.
Hi there. My question is, your shop might be on the high street, you see them all the time now walking into Chicago. Where were people doing the tattoo work in the past? You didn't talk a little bit about that. And it's sort of like, were they going to a friend and they would just do it? But they seem to be a little bit more elaborate and more with artistic ability. So.
Yeah, that's a great question. Formal tattoo shops emerged in the late 1900s, the late 18th century. Before that, they emerged slightly before the development of the electric tattoo machine, so they're not actually associated with that. It's more sort of, that's a time period when a lot of business actually starts moving out of people's homes to shops and things like that. Before that, we tend to have tattooers setting up in transient places, right? The pilgrimage tattooers would set up near pilgrimage sites during the time of year, like Easter, when people would go to that pilgrimage site, right? We would have that Civil War era tattoo I showed you on Longfellow's shoulder, itinerant battlefield tattooers who would travel around and tattoo. So before the late 1900s, it's in people's houses, it's itinerant tattooers, it's that kind of practice. And, you know, right slightly before the turn of the 20th century is when we start to see formal tattooing in shops. Of course, we still do have, throughout the history, itinerant artists and artists who move around, and we still have this today as well.
Great, we have a question right over here.
Hey, could you speak just a little bit more as to the psychology of why people want to use their body as canvas?
That's a great question, too. I could say that there are almost as many reasons to get tattoos as there are types of tattooing, but I think that there are a number of reasons that are some of the most popular. One is memorialization, either of a person, of a trip, a place, a thing that you love. One is rites of passage. You know, you turn 18 or 21 and you can finally get a tattoo and you go with your friends to all get tattoos together. One is therapeutic and healing. Another is identity, both personal identity, getting your own initials, getting something that is particularly important to you, or occupational identity is a big one, or gang identity, group identity. Those are some of the bigger motivations. But because you can't lose it, right? It's very hard to erase a tattoo. I mean, you have to concertedly erase a tattoo, right? The permanence adds emphasis forever to that gesture of memorializing something or identifying something, right? Oh, do we want to get the mic?
We've got a question up
Okay,
here.
yeah. We'll put you in the queue.
Touching on the psychology of tattoos, I see that you have quite a few. Do you have one tattoo in particular that's symbolic or very sentimental to you?
Oh, I have so many. Yeah, there are many. So many, too many. Yeah.
Maybe like a top 2 or 3.
It's so hard, right? It's so hard. I've written about some of them on my website. Oh, right, I should plug my website and my book. There, you gave me a great segue to plug my website. I've written about some of them on my website, which is tattoohistorian.com.
We have a question right over here.
Yeah, is there a link between tattoos and hennas that are used in Southeast Asia? You went back and looked at the history.
Yeah, so in some cultures we find both semi-permanent skin staining, henna, or in some cultures it's not henna but similar substances, and tattoos where we sometimes see overlap in the patterns. In India, for example, sometimes you see overlap in the patterns. South America, sometimes you see overlap in the patterns. And even in Morocco, you sometimes see overlap in some of the patterns. The tattoo traditions there are kind of different. Sometimes there's overlap, and sometimes they're independent. Some cultures only have body staining and never tattooing. More cultures, I would say, only have tattooing and never body staining. So it varies.
We have one right here.
When I first got my first tattoo, there were no women in the shop. And over the years, as I've gotten more and more, there are more women.
Yes.
Could you talk about the increased amount of women tattooers?
Yeah, and Esther might even want to speak to that as well. When I first got into tattooing in the late 1980s, female tattooers were few and far between. I only ever saw them if I went to a big tattoo convention, and even then there were maybe 2 or 3 in the whole convention. It's been really exciting that more and more women have taken this on as an art form and a business practice. It was a real struggle. A lot of women that I know that tattoo, either had to withstand a lot of hazing in shops to get those skills, or they just had to learn on their own. Now we have women mentoring women, so it's sort of, it's become a much better environment under which women can learn to tattoo because they can learn from other women. And we do have guys who are more open-minded now, but partly that dark age of American tattooing, American and European tattooing, really, it added this real machismic, tough guy edge to tattooing that only really recently is, in the past couple of decades, is starting to go away. When was your first tattoo? Not to date you or anything. Yeah. Yep, exactly. Yeah, that's right before we started to see a lot more women tattooers. Yeah.
We have time for one more question.
The one
more.
in front.
Can the tattoo dye ever be harmful to your body?
Yes, that's a great question. Some people, well, there's the contemporary answer and there's the historical answer. Historically, absolutely. Some of the pigments that were used in tattoos were not safe. Things like cadmium, I mean, people would get poisoned, allergic reactions. We still do have allergic reactions today. I personally, often with red, I personally have had a red reaction where just the part of one tattoo that had been tattooed with a certain red, it just took months to heal. My body did not want that particular pigment in there. Finally, it just kind of gave up. But yeah, you can have allergic reactions to some of the pigments. The FDA is actually considering regulating tattoo ink. And then in other countries, France also has a similar FDA equivalent that's also considering this. Honestly, this is a very controversial subject in the tattoo world. I think it would be a good thing, personally, to have these inks regulated, but it's very controversial. All right, so I'll be up here for a little bit if anybody has a burning question before they migrate everybody out of here. And thank you so much for coming, and